Hello, world mythers. So, we are in the throes of reading one of the, if not the oldest piece of recorded literature ever, which is really kind of cool, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This epic, has been around for approximately 4,000 years. What? 4,000 years. We know that this adventure takes place in Sumeria, in Mesopotamia, which would be now considered modern day like Iraq and like the Baghdad area in the Middle East. We know that there is some actual historical truth to this story. Um, Gilgamesh himself was a real king of Uruk, and he reigned approximately between 2800 to 2500 BCE. The earliest versions of this particular narrative were recorded at around 2100 BCE, but understandably, since this is such an incredibly old piece of writing, it has undergone numerous revisions, adaptations. The Sumerians were taken over by the Akkadians, and so there are some influences from that particular culture, particularly in the naming of the gods. You'll see kind of like both versions, the Sumerian and the Akkadian versions of gods throughout this piece, which is just sort of one example of how myths, especially a myth that has this type of historical circulation, how they actually adapt and get revised, both orally and in written form throughout the centuries. Um, you know, most of these texts, were written in cuneiform originally, and these tomes were lost for a considerable period of time. They were rediscovered in the mid 19th century on an archaeological dig in Mesopotamia. And since then, we're now reading a version of this particular myth that is probably dated to around 1200 BCE. So, this is a fascinating sort of history of the kind of circulation and adaptation and expansion of this particular hero's narrative, right? We're on our section on sort of the hero's journey, if you will. And we're going to start with Gilgamesh, and we're going to move through Homer's The Odyssey in the next week or so. So we have a lot to work with in this particular text, which will also set us up for when we do move on to the Odyssey. Gilgamesh is a really sort of interesting character. He's, first of all, human, or he's at least only semi divine, which makes him a sort of interesting character for us to critically unpack. There's a lot to work with Gilgamesh. He does represent some of the kind of classic characteristics of what we even in contemporary modern times would think of as like a hero. So, clearly he is brave, and he's strong, and he's physically beautiful and attractive, and he's willing to take risks in order to gain a sense of glory and notoriety and fulfillment. So he has these kind of fundamental qualities of what we look for in kind of like a blockbuster hero, even today, but he's a flawed character, which is really sort of his greatest kind of appeal, and perhaps one of the reasons why this story has endured and why his particular fame as this well-known king and hero has actually transcended throughout the ages. Gilgamesh is he's imperfect, right? I mean, he's brash and he's a bit of a bully. He's egotistical, at least in the beginning of the story, of course. He's a sexual predator. I mean, there's some knocks against Gilgamesh. He's sort of an off-putting character for us to take on until he obviously comes into contact with Enkidu, who is his sort of double or his equal in a lot of ways. And Enkidu's influence on Gilgamesh sort of tames him in some ways. They serve as these kind of sparring partners for each other, literally in the beginning with their manly wrestling match. And then, sort of in terms of their personalities, which we started to really look at in our first discussion forum about the ways in which Enkidu and Gilgamesh sort of mirror each other. Enkidu obviously coming sort of from the wild, representing nature, living peacefully and respectfully within nature, and Gilgamesh, of course, deeply entrenched in civilization, in culture, in sort of having all of the power and material possessions that one could ever want, but also not living peacefully, right? Being at odds with his people, and also, more importantly, sort of being in some sense of conflict within himself, right? He has this incredible desire and need to immortalize himself, right, among his people. He is so egotistical that he cannot fathom his own mortality. So, what he tries to do is push the limits of humanity and go beyond them by defeating death, for example, by claiming a sense of glory for accomplishing feats that no other human could. And he does in a lot of ways. But of course, the journey that he goes on, while it is certainly, a physical journey of sorts, is more importantly a sort of spiritual journey. It's an internal. Gilgamesh is at war with himself internally, and in losing Enkidu, we see another sort of human side of him, where he's dealing with feelings that we can all sort of acknowledge and relate to, right? He's dealing with grief, he's dealing with sadness, he's dealing with his rage and his anger over losing his sort of brother, his best friend. These are all things that we can sort of relate to, and part of the reason why this particular tale has endured. We've also started to unpack some of the other more universal themes that we see in this text. So we've identified nature versus culture, and that clash between the two of them as being kind of central. There's this sort of there's this tension between the two in this particular myth. We see issues of friendship, of loyalty, of adventure, of mortality. We also see the sort of human development of the spirit in this particular myth, which is also one of its kind of like universal appeals, right? So I want us to keep some of these themes in mind as we proceed through the rest of the myth. Use Joseph Campbell, who is an American mythologist, lecturer, educator, who comes up with this term, the monomyth, which is really just for the purposes of our use for it, for Gilgamesh and also for the Odyssey. His ideas are that irregardless of historical time period or culture, these hero journeys tend to all take the sort of same form, and they all tend to follow in a specific order. And he also talks about how these journeys are often physical, but also, and like almost more importantly, spiritual and internal, right? It is about confronting one's demons, confronting one's fears, and evolving as a human being. And we will see that evolution in Gilgamesh over the course of these next few chapters as we finish this historic sort of tale. So keep some of these themes in mind. More themes may come to light as we continue on, and I really want us to collectively keep in mind the use value of this particular type of myth. How is this myth still relevant today in our own contemporary society with our own modern dilemmas and problems? Keep some of these questions in mind as we proceed through the rest of the story and finish our discussion on Gilgamesh on a Sunday evening. Okay, that's all for now.